By the end of the war, Europe looks powerful. Its leaders negotiate as equals. Its economies rank among the largest in the world. Its cities project confidence, stability, and history. But power is not what appears on the surface. Real power is revealed only in moments of stress, when markets freeze, when currencies wobble, and when systems face collapse. In those moments, Europe does not decide first. It waits. Not because it is weak, but because it is embedded. This is not the story of invasion or defeat. This is the story of how Europe was rebuilt inside a system it does not control, and why exiting that system now feels more dangerous than dependence itself. By the end of this reconstruction, Europe had not lost a war on the battlefield. It had surrendered the mechanics of its power to accounting and credit, quietly and invisibly, under the guise of recovery and partnership. Before the 20th century shattered everything, Europe did not follow global systems. Europe created them. London was the world's financial heart. Paris, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt are arteries of global capital. European banks financed railways, ports, and industries across continents. Trade routes were written in European contracts. Currencies issued from European treasuries settled international accounts. Gold flowed through European vaults. Even the early rise of the United States leaned on European capital. Its industrial expansion was financed externally before it became self-sustaining. Europe did not just hold power, it defined what power looked like. That is why what follows is not simply decline, it is displacement. World War II is remembered through images of destruction, but the deeper damage never made headlines. The war did not just destroy cities, it liquidated balance sheets. To survive, European states borrowed relentlessly. They sold overseas assets. They ran down gold reserves built over centuries. Victory did not restore those reserves. It exposed their absence. Britain emerged from the war militarily triumphant and financially exhausted. France was liberated, but hollowed out. Germany was defeated and dismantled. Across the continent, the same reality appeared under different flags. Europe was alive, but financially empty. The war ended in 1945, but the debt did not. The immediate post-war period confronted Europe with a problem it could not ignore. Cities had to be rebuilt, factories reactivated, and governments stabilized. Social unrest needed containment, populations needed employment, and legitimacy had to be restored. All of this required money, stable currency, and confidence, but Europe had none in sufficient quantity. There was only one economy that had survived the war intact, that had industrial output, gold reserves, and liquidity: the United States. America had not been ravaged by total war. Its industries were fully operational, its currency was strong, its gold reserves had grown, its financial systems were intact, functioning, and dominant. This was not a matter of moral choice. It was a matter of arithmetic and access. Europe's survival depended on America, and systems always follow the source of liquidity. If the flow is elsewhere, power migrates. Reconstruction is often described as generosity, as aid, as assistance. But systems do not rebuild neutrally. Aid is architecture. Money is leverage. The funds that flowed into Europe were denominated in dollars. Trade was routed through American markets. European currency stabilized only through external confidence. The recovery that appeared sovereign on the surface was actually constrained at every level by the framework of someone else's financial power. European governments could spend, invest, and rebuild, but only within the boundaries permitted by the liquidity that arrived from Washington. Each loan, each grant, each stabilized currency was a subtle tether. Dependence did not announce itself with armies. It announced itself with interest rates, reserve requirements, and trade agreements. At first, this felt like salvation. Stability always feels like freedom when the alternative is collapse. And so the trap was accepted willingly. Europe did not lose autonomy in a single moment. It chose alignment, because every alternative seemed far worse. Reject the new system, and the consequences were immediate and stark. Currency instability, trade isolation, political chaos, social unrest. Accept it, and recovery was guaranteed. At least in appearance, every rational, responsible decision reinforced the framework that would eventually constrain future choices. This is how dependency is normalized, not through coercion or threat, but through rational calculations made under extreme pressure. The logic was flawless, the consequences were inescapable. As reconstruction proceeded, the temporary solution hardened into structure. The dollar became the settlement layer, the currency against which other currencies measured themselves. Energy trades referenced it. Contracts were written in its denomination, reserves accumulated in it. Stability now depended not on European autonomy, but on continued access to a system that Europeans did not own. The paradox became clear. Recovery was successful, but success inside the system increased exposure to that system. The more Europe grew, the more it depended, and the cost of leaving escalated with every recovered factory, every stabilized currency, every trade agreement renewed. Here is the knife twist that most histories soften. They speak of partnership, cooperation, and shared responsibility. But cooperation requires symmetry, and this was never symmetrical. Europe did not rebuild independently and later integrate. It rebuilt already embedded within another nation's system. Not through occupation, not through coercion, not through visible domination, but through acceptance, normalization, and the illusion of choice. The decision looked responsible. That is why it succeeded. And that is why it trapped Europe more effectively than any army could have. By the early 1950s, Europe appeared stable, economies grew, populations recovered, confidence returned, institutions functioned. On paper, autonomy remained, but it was constrained in practice. Financial stability required predictability. Predictability required alignment. Alignment required compliance with a framework that Europeans did not control. Europe could govern itself in domestic matters. It could draft policies and enact laws. But it could not afford to take decisions that threatened the structure upon which its survival now rested. Markets punished deviation faster than governments could react. Interest rates, currency flows, trade credit, these became instruments of indirect control. Sovereignty became conditional, and every move had to be measured against the unseen hand that stabilized the continent. Modern power does not always announce itself with banners, troops, or commands. Often it operates invisibly through incentives and constraints. It moves through currency, liquidity, and confidence. Europe did not learn what it was forbidden to do. It learned what it could not afford to do, and that lesson was reinforced every time markets moved faster than policymakers. Decisions once made independently now required permission of a different kind. Approval by the system itself. Every trade, every investment, every stabilization policy was implicitly priced against the risk of violating that system. By the time Europe fully recovered industrially, the trap had been set permanently. Recovery had succeeded too well. Trade volumes grew, cross-border capital flows normalized. Financial integration became a necessity. The more Europe stabilized, the higher the cost of stepping outside the architecture that guaranteed that stability. Autonomy became synonymous with volatility. Leaving the system was no longer a choice. It became a financial and political risk. Dependence did not arrive suddenly. It arrived gradually, intelligently, through rational decisions disguised as responsibility. It arrived under the cover of recovery and growth, so that when the consequences became apparent, it was too late to reverse course without triggering crisis. Europe did not collapse, it was absorbed. Every decision it made reinforced the architecture that constrained it. Every step toward recovery deepened dependency. Sovereignty remained a word, but the reality was different. Autonomy existed in theory, not in consequence. And that is why leaving now is not a political question. It is a systemic one. The trap is invisible, silent, and inescapable. By the end of this first phase of reconstruction, Europe had not simply rebuilt. It had rebuilt itself inside someone else's framework, stabilized by someone else's liquidity, and guaranteed by someone else's markets. Nothing had gone wrong. That was the danger. There had been no dramatic collapse, no military defeat, no announcement of subordination. There had only been a sequence of intelligent, rational decisions that quietly transferred leverage from Europe to the United States. The continent that once defined global power now relied on the mechanics of a system it did not control. And once that dependence was normalized, reversing it became inconceivable. Stability had been achieved. Independence had been surrendered, and the cost of reclaiming it now would be far higher than anyone had anticipated. By the time Europe had rebuilt itself within the American system, the contours of power had shifted permanently. Stability had been restored, yet autonomy had quietly slipped through its fingers. Europe could govern in appearance, draft policies, enact laws, hold elections, but all of these acts occurred under constraints it barely recognized. Every decision now carried an implicit cost measured not in votes or popular support, but in the response of the system it had chosen to rely upon. Liquidity, interest rates, access to capital, all of these invisible levers dictated what Europe could do without destabilizing itself. And each passing year, the cost of stepping outside this architecture increased. The deeper the integration, the more dependent Europe became, until the notion of independent action felt synonymous with recklessness. The continent had achieved prosperity, growth, and recovery, but at the cost of its freedom to act independently. That freedom had been surrendered, not through force, but through logic, rationality, and necessity. Defense had always been portrayed as a separate issue, a matter of sovereignty, of military strength. Yet the moment Europe realized it could not guarantee its security without immense domestic expenditure, a subtle shift occurred. Outsourcing protection to America was presented as a practical, efficient solution. Armies could be smaller, budgets could be redirected, and the continent could focus on reconstruction. But security is never separate from finance. When a nation relies on external guarantees for protection, its political and economic decisions are inevitably influenced by the source of that protection. Europe did not relinquish defense because it was weak. It did so because it was rational. Building independent armies, acquiring nuclear capability, funding military research, these were all measures that competed with civilian growth, infrastructure rebuilding, and social stability. When the logic of survival favors alignment with a stronger partner, autonomy is surrendered incrementally, imperceptibly, and willingly. This dependence became invisible over time. European defense planning was no longer autonomous, not because instructions were given, but because assumptions had shifted. It was assumed that America would respond first, that America would absorb shocks, that deviation would be punished indirectly through market responses or political isolation. Policymakers no longer asked whether Europe could act independently. They asked how markets, allies, and global systems would react if Europe attempted to act alone. Sovereignty was transformed into a condition of compliance. The illusion of freedom persisted, but it was hollow, constrained by the invisible hand of systemic dependence. Europe had become a participant in a system whose rules it did not set, and which it could not influence without risking catastrophic instability. Now Europe had been absorbed not by conquest or force, but through responsible, rational choices under pressure. Each step toward efficiency, stability, and recovery reinforced the architecture that bound it. Delegation and alignment were rational, logical, and justified, but they came with consequences that were neither visible nor acknowledged. Every act that appeared voluntary also tightened the invisible chains. By the time the consequences became clear, the options to reverse course were economically, politically, and socially prohibitive. Power had been transferred silently, elegantly, irrevocably. Financial dependence reinforced security dependence. As decades passed, markets demonstrated where authority truly resided. Interest rates, liquidity, trade flows, and investor confidence no longer followed European governments. They followed American responses, signals, and decisions. When stress appeared in European economies, the first stabilization measures originated outside Europe. Policy was reactive, never proactive. Sovereignty did not disappear in a dramatic declaration. It was gradually eroded by the architecture of the system itself. Dependence became a natural, internalized behavior. Governments adapted to the constraints, anticipating them, acting within them, rationalizing them as prudence. The paradox of autonomy became fully visible in the post-war decades. Europe was industrially and financially strong. Its economies produced, its populations thrived, its cities expanded, yet independence had become unattainable without risk. Every successful integration into global markets increased exposure to the system that guaranteed that stability. Every recovered factory, every revived currency, every successful trade network deepened dependency. What had been necessary for survival had become a structural trap. Leaving the system was no longer a matter of will, it was a financial gamble with potentially devastating consequences. Independence had been rationally abandoned under the guise of efficiency and prudence. The continent that had once dictated terms now operated within constraints. It had normalized, accepted, and even defended. Markets became the arbiters of behavior. Crises, real or perceived, illuminated the structure of dependence with brutal clarity. When liquidity froze, dollars flowed in to stabilize systems. When currencies threatened to collapse, intervention originated externally. Political decisions no longer anchored stability, confidence did. And that confidence rested in a place Europe did not control. Every negotiation, every policy choice, every effort at reform was measured against its alignment with the expectations of the system. The consequences of deviation became obvious in retrospect. Markets punished, investors withdrew, and crises emerged, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. Sovereignty existed only in the ability to absorb these shocks without catastrophe. Independence became a theoretical construct, never a practical option. Now Europe no longer debated whether it should align with the system. The real question was how much turbulence independence would cause. This is not a partnership. This is structural capture. The trap had been set so efficiently that compliance was indistinguishable from survival. Every choice for alignment was rational, reasonable, and justified, but the sum total was a continent whose decisions were constrained by forces it could not influence. Autonomy was conditional, negotiable, and ultimately unavailable. By the time the realization sank in, independence had become synonymous with instability. European policymakers no longer asked whether they could act independently. They asked how the system would respond if they tried. The notion of leaving the framework that guaranteed stability felt reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous. To challenge the system was to invite economic collapse, political crisis, and social unrest. Rationality itself had become a leash. And rationality, when combined with structural dependence, is more constraining than any law or army. Policies, budgets, and decisions became implicitly guided by the mechanics of the external system, until independence was unthinkable in practice, even if it remained conceivable in theory. Modern Europe, then, operates not without power, but within managed power. It produces, trades, governs, and legislates, but always within boundaries defined by external structures. Assets are not seized, they are integrated. Decisions are not forbidden, they are priced. Influence is not overtly imposed, it is normalized. Stability rewards alignment, while deviation is costly. The continent retains authority only within a cage of invisible constraints, and every rational choice deepens that cage. The very mechanisms that stabilized Europe after the war now ensure that the continent remains structurally dependent, almost permanently. The system endures precisely because it feels voluntary. Every choice can be justified, for stability, for growth, for efficiency. Every act that strengthens the framework appears prudent, responsible, and rational, yet the sum of these acts is a loss of independence. Cumulative rationality, not coercion, achieve the outcome. Systems do not collapse through brute force. They collapse through decisions that individually appear intelligent. And here lies the quiet genius of modern dominance. It leaves no visible scars, demands no conquest, and issues no ultimatums. By the time its consequences are recognized, it is already permanent. The dangerous myth of reversibility lingers in public imagination. Many believe Europe could simply reclaim autonomy, but the deeper the integration, the higher the exit costs. Currency networks do not dissolve quietly. Trade flows cannot be redirected without disruption. Investor confidence cannot be reset on command. Every layer of integration, every decade of aligned decision-making, every subtle constraint absorbed into policy multiplies the risk of acting independently. Structural capture, once established, is almost impossible to reverse without crisis. History demonstrates that the costs of reversing embedded dependence are often catastrophic, and the forces that maintain the system are designed to respond swiftly and efficiently. This is not unique to Europe. It is a pattern repeated throughout history. Empires do not fall because they lose battles. They fall because they outsource leverage, normalize dependency, and mistake stability for control. By the time military force appears necessary, finance has already redistributed power. Sovereignty is lost incrementally, invisibly, and irreversibly. And Europe's experience is a warning, not a story of anomaly. It is a demonstration of how systems, when designed to reward alignment and punish deviation, can absorb even the most powerful actors quietly and permanently. Look at the present. Observe how crises are managed. Observe where liquidity originates. Observe whose decisions calm markets fastest. These are not accidents. They are indicators of structural authority. And indicators do not lie. Europe did not wake up dependent in a single moment. It arrived here carefully, intelligently, through a series of rational, responsible decisions. Nothing appears broken. Nothing appears coercive. Everything appears sensible. And that is why this dependence is so enduring, so invisible, and so irreversible. Europe did not collapse. It was absorbed. Every decision it made reinforced the architecture that constrained it. Every act of alignment, every rational policy, every choice made under the guise of prudence tightened the trap. Sovereignty exists, yet it is hollow. Autonomy exists, yet it is impractical. Stability has been achieved, independence has been surrendered, and the system that guarantees continued prosperity ensures that deviation carries consequences too heavy to contemplate. Europe functions, governs, and survives, but only within the invisible boundaries drawn by the system it now relies upon entirely. And this is the final, uncomfortable truth. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves through liquidity, trust, and alignment. Sometimes it stabilizes a continent and absorbs it quietly, so that by the time realization comes, options are gone. Europe did not surrender in defeat, nor did it collapse in crisis. It was absorbed, managed, and integrated, and every act of rationality, every effort to rebuild responsibly, ensured the permanence of its dependence. History repeats, because systems designed to reward alignment and punish deviation almost always succeed, and systems change only on their own terms, not the terms of those who think they are in control.